It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Road Tulips Consulting. We're here with Season 7. So glad you're joining us. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp, CAEACNP, and I'm so glad you're here for this exciting year of so many great topics, so don't forget to subscribe. We have a returning guest this week. It's Michael Randel. He's a consultant that looks at the world a little differently. He's going to get us thinking about the power of pushback and why resistance drives transformation. Wow, what a topic. It's Monday, March 10th, 2025. Welcome to episode 276. Hey everybody, it's Monday, March 10th. Can you believe it? We're almost halfway through the month already, and it's the last month of the first quarter. Who knew the time would go so quickly, but 2025 has been interesting to say the least. Hi, I'm Cecilia Supp. I'm your host. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Radio Free 501c. I'm welcoming back Michael Randel, who always brings us interesting ideas about how to approach working with members and our other stakeholders, and maybe people that we have alliances or coalitions with. But before we dive into that topic, and Michael tells us a little bit more about himself, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our global audience, and thanks again for joining us. If you haven't yet subscribed or followed us on your favorite podcast service, please take a moment and do that now, because you don't want to miss any of these really intriguing ideas like we're going to talk about today. Our topic today is the power of pushback and why resistance drives transformation. And I think we need some transformation in the nonprofit management profession as well as our entire community. But before we start that conversation, Michael, welcome back. Haven't seen you since last summer. Glad you're here. Would you like to say hello and tell us a little about yourself?
Hello, Cecilia. It's nice to see you again after these months. So I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I run my consulting practice, Randel Consulting Associates, and I work with leaders and teams as they're going through change and growth. So I encounter lots of leaders who are grappling with resistance and pushback and not sure what to make of it.
Now, Michael, I love this topic. As you and I were preparing for this episode, we shared a lot of our ideas. But could you share with the audience what you mean by pushback?
Well, my primary focus is change in organizations or within organizational systems and networks. And when people come to me and they're talking about pushback, what's typically happening is it's a leader or a change group that has a great idea that they're trying to roll out, but they're encountering what they call pushback or resistance. In other words, people don't like or don't understand what they're trying to do. And it causes confusion for these leaders because they had assumed to some extent that people would love change. But the reality is quite different from that.
Well, and what do you think are the obstacles to leaders not seeing the fact that maybe they haven't clearly communicated the purpose of the change?
I think part of the problem for leaders is indeed they haven't communicated the need for change. But then also what happens sometimes is that leaders have embarked on the road to change too quickly, right? They might have used this notion, and I wrote about this in a recent newsletter, ready, fire, aim, right? So they feel there's a need, there's a pressure to act, there's an urgency. And they haven't taken the time to check in about, well, how do we need to change? Who needs to join us on this path of change? And so they can sometimes make a unilateral decision, or they're just consulting a small group of trusted advisors, but they're not engaging wider stakeholders who are going to be impacted by this change, for better or for worse.
That is a really great point. And you remind me of what we share with CAE candidates as they're preparing for the exam. If you're the chief staff executive, you have to get input from everyone who's going to be affected by the decision. So you're looking at a problem or a question. So you might need to solve a problem or answer a question or address an issue that's external to the organization. You can't do that in a vacuum. And when you do make that decision, you need to be transparent. I think we really see leaders fail when they're not transparent. I think we all saw what happened at the American Institute of Architects there was no ill intention from the senior leadership or the board of directors, but it didn't come across that way. So changes were happening that the membership didn't understand, and the membership got angry. And so, yeah, they confronted some negative resistance. But you think that resistance can also be positive. So, what are some positive examples of resistance? Because I know we all think, if you're like me and you like Star Trek, it's the Borg, resistance is futile. You're going to be absorbed into the collective. And I think if leaders take that attitude of you're going to be absorbed if you like it or not, that really puts people off. So, what are some of those positive aspects of resistance?
Yeah. Well, let me kind of make a statement. Resistance is the sign of life.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sign that people care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what they care about might not be the same thing that you care about or that you think they should be caring about. So that, opens up a dialogue. But the fact that people are pushing back means that actually it can mean one of three things. It can mean that they don't understand the change, and therefore there's a need for communication and messaging to help put the change in a context. Um, the second thing it can mean is they don't like the change, right? And what I find very often is those people see the need for change, but they don't like the particular change because they think a different choice should have been made. And then the third way people resist is when they don't like the leader, right?
Oh, yeah.
So no matter what they would have announced as a change, no matter how much consultation they did, they would not have won over those people.
Mm-hmm.
So those are three very, very different ways in which people are going to show up, in which the pushback's going to happen. And so it's really important that leaders take care to distinguish what kind of pushback am I experiencing and develop an appropriate response and not make the mistake of thinking that it's all of one kind that just needs to be pushed back against even harder by the leaders.
Now, that's interesting, your third one, which reminds me of a book that came out many years ago. I think it was 15 years or more, called Likeonomics. People work with people they like. So
Mhm.
you're right. If somebody doesn't like the leader, they're not going to like anything they say or do because we're emotional beings. It's hard to set that aside and be objective. So, do you have any advice for leaders who may be in that situation? Because everybody isn't liked by everyone.
It's not the job of leaders to be liked by everybody, right? We've
Right.
all seen, I think, leaders who try to get approval from all their different stakeholders. And that can often mean that they're changing their opinions or even their decisions about things based on who was the most recent group to speak to them. Not being liked by a group, and let's take it as a group dynamic, not just an individual who doesn't like you. Not being liked by a group should be information for a leader that there's something going on with that stakeholder group, right? Now, we could do another whole podcast about power dynamics in organizations and associations. And so that's part of it, right? Where does the locus of power sit? Does it sit, for example, in the national office CEO? Does it sit with the board? Does it sit with the leaders of affiliates or local chapters, right? And that can often be a tussle within organizations and a source of pushback and resistance. But I think the key thing is to be alert that when this is happening, it's it's a sign of low trust, perhaps even broken trust. And then that should make us start thinking about, well, how might we come together to peel back the layers and see if we can identify what's the thing at the heart of why we're all involved in this work, in this endeavor. What do we have in common, right? Maybe it's a shared vision, maybe it's shared values, maybe it's concern for the same audience you're trying to serve. And when you start by finding that thing you have in common, from there you can then begin working on, so what are the differences we have about how best to do that? Right? So it's not trying to dominate the other. It's not trying to win at all costs, but rather it's about being curious to really come back to fundamentals. What do we share? and how can we find ways to work together around that common purpose.
That collaboration. That's a requirement. I do believe people can work together and collaborate even if they don't necessarily like each other. But I also agree with you 100%. Leaders aren't there to be liked. It's not their job to be liked. It's their job to lead and to do their work and to think about everybody involved in the organization or team that they're leading, depending on what level of leadership you're at. I also agree with you. I have a saying, if everybody likes you, you're doing something wrong, because everybody
That's a
shouldn't be
good one.
liked by everyone. Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, no, you are doing something wrong. So that's a whole other podcast too. It's like dealing with taking your own position, your own stand on things, especially in a in a leadership role, I should say, in an organization, because you cannot make everyone happy all the time. So nobody is going to like every decision you make. They might grudgingly go along with it because, well, I don't like it, but I don't have a choice. And well, okay, it's not as bad as it could be. But I think your points about losing trust and seeing that because you're seeing a segment of your membership or your community that is actively speaking against you in a negative way and challenging these changes, challenging these decisions. People talk a lot about change management. Change management is just, to me, an oxymoron. I'm just going to say it because you cannot manage change because change is a constant. What we can manage is how we present it, how we explain it, the transparency levels that we have, and how people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And this is why, in that discovery phase that you mentioned earlier, where you're talking to the stakeholders, you ask a lot of questions. You don't just say, hey, we're going to do this thing. You say, I have an idea. Maybe we could improve this process. What do you think? And Cheryl Ronk, who's a longtime friend of mine and colleague, and we collaborate on education courses together, has a wonderful saying, people support that which they help create. And so that can help us use this energy of resistance and pushback to help us move things forward. So you had mentioned as we were talking, as we prepared, that there is no formula for the right frequency that works for everybody. Could you expand on that thought?
Yeah. So, Cecilia, I'm going to pick up that you have a radio receiver in the background of your image. And people may not remember what it used to be like, but back in the old days, giving my age away here, you could turn the dial and move through different frequencies. And as you did so, you would pick up different stations, different styles of music, different kinds of talk shows and things like that. So you could sort of find the one that worked for you and then zoom in on that. I think the same is true in terms of how we lead our organizations and do our work. There's no one way of doing things, right?
Mhm.
We have to kind of go through the sort of frequency dial, listening to different snippets to get a sense of what sounds right. And to remember that what sounds right will work for now, but it's not going to work forever, right? I've been looking at a couple of case stories recently. Um, a couple of different organizations that just turned 40 years old, right? So they were founded in the early mid 1980s, right? First of all, wow, that was 40 years ago.
Already?
Um, it's like that's my music and things like that. Um, but what's really interesting in these two case studies is the numbers of times these organizations have pivoted in terms of their strategic priorities, their focus, their programming, and things like that, while continuing with the same essential mission. So I think that's really, really interesting. It's like, how do we find ways to endure with that which matters most, right? The core impact, the core change we want to make, but not become wedded to a particular program, a particular skill set, a particular approach or geography. I think that's where we need to have the flexibility, like, paying attention to what's going on, scanning the radio frequencies to find what's the right way of doing it for now.
Mhm.
And, I will come back to pushback. Whenever And actually, let me put the challenge this way.
Mhm.
Let's think of an association where there's a national office, and there's members, and there might be individual members, there might be organizations, there might be chapters and things like that. Sitting in the national office, you're going to be exposed to different information, different perspectives that are not going to be easily available to your local members, right? So as a national leader, you might anticipate trends that are going to impact your industry before your members start to become aware of it. So you're trying to prod them, nudge them to pay attention to something that they think doesn't matter yet. Conversely, people on the ground, being closer to the ground, closer to the dynamics, will be seeing things that matter, that are going to become significant, that may not yet be visible to the national office. So there's a dynamic tension there. How do you introduce ideas that people should be paying attention to when they actually like the way things are being done at the moment? And I think this is where we get into the dynamic of pushback and resistance, because people don't see the need to make any changes yet. Although we then have, I'm going to call them activists, people who are championing a way to make something happen, but that message is not yet being tolerated in the wider system.
Mhm.
So there becomes this pushback and even rejection of the move for change. So, it's can feel quite hard in the moment. But this is the grist of organizational life. This is what makes it dynamic and helps organizations find ways towards relevance.
I just I think that the organizational dynamics are really the thing that trips us all up. Especially when you pointed out there are ideas that maybe the national leadership sees, or trends or environmental shifts that maybe the rest of the membership hasn't seen yet. They don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I'll think about it tomorrow, as Scarlett O'Hara said. But I think when we're looking at that, we also have to look at two things. People fear the unknown, and that's part of that. And then the other thing is people don't want to change a system that they benefit from. And that's the problem. It's why H&R Block lobbies against making the tax code easier to understand, because they benefit from the current system. They will lose business if the system changes. So when you have activists who are working to keep the system the same because they like it that way or they're benefiting from it, they're not thinking in a leadership mindset. They're not thinking about what's best for everybody. They're thinking about what's best for themselves. And that's a problem. But then you do need what you might call a positive activist to go out and be your ambassador for that new idea, to talk to the other groups. And I think a lot of times, in these federated structures, no matter if it's an actual federation or you have real chapters, or I say real chapters, okay, you might call your groups chapters, but they might actually be affiliates. Buy my book and you can see the explanation there. But seriously, you might have chapters that are, classic chapters, meaning they're part of the organization, or you might have affiliated chapters, which means they're people you partner with because you work in the same area. If you dictate to those people, they are always going to give you negative resistance and negative pushback. But if you work with them, talk with them, let them contribute, then you're going to have that positive resistance. You also had mentioned, Michael, you're a big believer in respecting the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that and how that helps leaders move things forward?
I love the expression that I heard from somebody. When you're trying to bring about change in an organization, go and talk to the cynics.
Mm.
Because the cynics are people who believe and value the organization's work, but are skeptical about the way in which it's being managed.
Mm.
Right? So they haven't given up. They're not, for example, this phrase presentism that sometimes gets used these days, right? People who are showing up at work, but not actually engaged and motivated. People like cynics care. They want it to get better. So the pushback we might hear from a cynic is actually saying, hey, we have energy about this place. we are energized to see it get better, right? And we may not like the way you're going about it, or we may think you're missing some key information. But they would essentially, they're being asked to be invited into the change process, right? Doesn't mean that they want to like now join a subcommittee or a task force, but they may want to be able to have a venue within which to share their views and opinions, or to share information that they can see. So as a leader, I would actually say, and this may not be the message that leaders are going to welcome, but the message is, if there's no resistance, then you're in trouble. Because it means people don't care enough. They don't have enough energy to push back. And that is a really big warning sign for leaders that something is seriously wrong in their organizational system.
I agree with that 100%. Having worked with chapters and other volunteer groups like special interest groups, committees, a lot of different components during my career, you need tension. Tension's what holds things together, and not all tension is bad. There's positive tension, like suspension bridges would not stay up if there was no tension. Your muscles wouldn't let you walk and stand up if there was no tension. So tension's not a bad thing. Tension's energy. So I agree with you 100%. I mean, if there's no resistance, you're in trouble, because that means there's no energy, because whatever energy they have, they're taking somewhere else. They don't think that your organization's worth that investment of their energy. I think that's fantastic. I love that. So I know there is a lot more we can talk about here. Now, we have already touched on federations, membership communities, and things like that. You mentioned something that I think we know in the profession, but don't actually talk about it too much, that tension between staff and volunteers. Because that is a different kind of tension, because staff is like, well, I'm paid, I'm a professional, I know what I'm doing. And volunteers are like, well, but I'm in the profession or industry, I know what I'm doing, and I think I should do it this way. So what are some things you've seen in that kind of relationship?
I've seen lots of different things, but what comes to my mind right now is an example from early in my career. I was still living in South Africa, working there, and I was part of an organization that had a very, very, very small national office, literally just a executive director, an admin person, a finance person, right? And so the work of the organization was done by local chapters across the country. For a variety of reasons, the national office began to staff up. It began to hire a program officer. It began to hire people in a couple of specialist roles. And what I noticed was the volunteer engagement, if you will, the member engagement declined, because what I think was happening was that the professional staff in the national office behaved and believed, I think, that it was their job to run programs. So the members could then sort of step back and say, well, okay, somebody else is taking care of it. But maybe also an element of the members are not being invited to help in co-creating and collaborating around developing and running these programs. So I thought that was a very, very interesting tension, right? So on one hand, perhaps the quality of the programming was improving, right? Because you had an actual specialist working on it with dedicated time and resources. But then on the other hand, we were seeing this decline in engagement. And with that, I think also reduced the possibility for the program reaching into more parts of the country, rather than being more limited to the central urban areas. So this gets to attention. Attention is a lovely word. I think it might also be worth thinking about it in terms of paradoxes. And even I like to think about continua, right? Because it's all about finding the balancing point. And that has to be continually renegotiated. What's the right balance in this tension that works for now, right? And keeping open that this is not a forever solution, but it makes sense given who we are, given the current context we're in, the resources we have available to us, this is how we should do that. And I think one of the kind of the key tensions in the staff volunteer dynamic is, to what extent does a staff person or a staff team serve and enable the volunteers to act versus taking on responsibility for delivering the program and tapping volunteers as adjuncts, right?
Mm-hmm.
As contributors, but not as the main implementers.
And I think that's really that balance between volunteer contribution, because you want them to have a good experience, but they're not unpaid staff. And that brings us back to one of your earlier points about transparency and clarity and communication about what those roles are. And it sounds like in that situation, maybe the volunteers felt pushed aside and not wanted anymore or not needed.
Yeah, that was very much a dynamic. In South Africa, the context also was, this was the early 90s. So it was the kind of ending of apartheid and moving towards what a new structure, a new society might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And there certainly wasn't agreement about what kind of programs this organization should be running in this changing context.
Right.
By hiring particular staff members, some of the leaders were making a choice or making a bet. We think the programming should look like this, and therefore we're hiring a person who can develop and run that kind of program. And other members saw that and felt, well, we don't want to be part of that. That's not how it should be done. We think the way we've been doing it is the way we should keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it really became an interesting tussle. And I'm going to use two politically loaded words, but with small letters, not caps. But between one grouping that was wanting to conserve the value of what the organization was about, what were some of its historic ways of making a difference,
Mm-hmm.
and others who wanted to progress, to move into new ways, serving new audiences, right? Both of them driven by the same impulse, right? How do we make the biggest difference to our key audience? But seeing different ways of making that happen. And we had some very interesting meetings, with interesting being code for friction and conflict and all sorts of other things like that.
Mm-hmm. People arguing their position,
Right.
pushing, and that's a great example of an external factor in the changing environment affecting how we do things internally, because that organization was operating in a brand new society in a lot of ways, maybe not brand new, but very different society. So that is actually a great lead into the last item I wanted to talk with you about before we wrap up, and that is the power of transformation and how resistance, that energy of the resistance, can actually move along the transformation of the organization. So what are some of your thoughts on that, about using that energy to actually transform? Because resistance is one thing, but transformation is becoming something new, different, more evolved. So how can that support transformation?
I'd like to say first that transformation need not be a scary word.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It does not necessarily have to mean we're changing all of our programs, we're changing all of our structures, we're changing our mission. It can mean something as simple as we're going to change completely the way we engage our members or the ways in which we serve our key audiences. So I think there's a lot of positive elements in how we think about transformation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we really want to harness the power of transformation and really benefit from pushback in that process, we're best served by doing this work early on in the process, right? The process, and I often think about being a leader is like being a gardener,
Mm-hmm.
right? Particularly in associations, they've got long histories. So there's been people who led before us, and we can be sure people will follow after us. So really, we don't own this place, but rather we're stewards of it. We're responsible for now, and we want to leave it in the best possible condition for the people who will follow us.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true for a gardener. right? You typically don't have a highly aggressive approach as a gardener. You're taking what you have, you're looking to improve it, strengthen it, make it more beautiful, make it more fruitful, so that others in the future will benefit from it. And so I think the key thing for a gardener is the time that they spend in preparation, taking stock of what's available to them. What's the soil condition? How much rainfall do we get here? Where's the sun coming from? What kind of plants grow best in this climate? Right. And so organizationally, that's about where we are doing consultations. We're engaging stakeholders and understanding what their needs and requests are. We're mapping the internal and external environment. What's the need for change? What would happen if we do this versus that? So that process of preparation is the opportunity to invite in all the different voices, and to, I think, particularly invite in the skeptics and the cynics and those who have different agendas, because they are there. And if they're not invited in during this preparation stage, when they can inform and help shape what are you going to be doing, then they're going to be pouncing on you once you start carrying out your plan, right? So pushback can be expected. Pushback that is unexpected, I think, is a sign of maybe a poor leadership work, that you weren't paying attention to your different stakeholders. And so better, I think, to experience the pushback during that phase of preparing and shaping, rather than when you've shipped out the finished product and then you discover that people don't like it and push back against it.
Yes. I agree with you. I am a gardener, so I love that analogy. It very much is preparation, checking out the environment, making sure you're leaving it ready to grow something new, which is, I always think of transformation as a positive, because you've transformed, and transformation takes energy and growth and a certain commitment to transform. So I just think that's a wonderful thought. And speaking of thoughts, as you know, I like to ask my guests to share the one thought you'd like the audience to take away today. And if they'd like to reach out to you and learn more about your views on pushback and transformation and how that energy can actually be a positive, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, let me start by letting people know how to get in touch with me. I'm active on LinkedIn, so look for me there, Michael Randel. You can also go to my website, which is rcachangeadvisors.com. And in the resources there, you're going to find some material about navigating your stakeholder ecosystem, right? That, I think, taps into many of the things we're talking about today. And so I think it's the parting thought I want to leave with your listeners. Being a leader, leading change, leading transformation is a dynamic process. And you have multiple stakeholders that you're working with, and they do not have the same point of view or opinion about things. And so as a leader, you're going to have to navigate through all of those different demands. Some of them will be forces that will propel you forward, and others will be forces that might seek to push you back or to keep you static. But all of that is the environment within which you're working, and that's what you have to as available to you as the soil, if you will, as a leader. And those are the things you work with to help bring about new services, new programs, stronger organizations that will go out and make a difference and an impact in the world.
That's not just a closing thought, that's an action plan. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for joining me again on Radio Free 501c.
It's been a lot of fun again, Cecilia. Thank you for the invitation.
You are welcome. And I look forward to having you back, because you're always bringing these big ideas that I don't think we pay enough attention to sometimes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, we have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So another reminder, if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, take a moment and do that, because you don't want to miss anything here in season 7. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box, check out our website, roguetulips.com, and then let's have a conversation and see if we can work together. If you're looking for nonprofit management education specifically, are you getting ready for the CAE exam? Check out our education page. There's still time to join our study group course. So that's all for this week. On behalf of Michael and myself, we'll see you next time. That's it for this week. I hope you really loved this episode as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Learn more about how our experience and knowledge at Rogue Tulips can give your organization the strategic edge to reach its goals. Check out our website at roguetulips.com. We'd love to talk with you and see how we can work together. Thanks.